In introducing Angus, I'm also pleased to welcome him home because he is very much a local boy from a multi-generational Melbourne family. His great-great-grandfather, I think, was the superintendent of the Kew Lunatic Asylum.
That's correct.
Angus graduated from the University of Melbourne, undertook further study at the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome and an internship at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice. He then returned to Melbourne, where he worked as aide to the Governor of Victoria, the civilian aide, so he didn't have the uniform, Dr. Davis McCackey, before taking up a Fulbright scholarship at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York. And finally, he got a real job as the Curator of European Art at the Art Gallery of South Australia, where he put together an exhibition which you may recall, the absolutely splendid Love and Death, Art in the Age of Queen Victoria. Then in 2003, he was appointed Senior Curator of Paintings and Sculpture at the Yale Centre for British Art, the position which he holds today. Angus is the author of numerous scholarly catalogues and articles, of two popular non-fiction volumes, A Brief History of the Smile, and his latest, which we will be puffing shamelessly in due course, The Finger, a Handbook. He also writes a voluminous and quite wonderful blog, the Tumbrel Diaries, which you must all have a squiz at later or even now on your handheld devices if you have them in flight mode. In the blog profile, Angus's list of interests not only includes relatively innocent eavesdropping and note-taking for future reference of loud public cell phone conversations and really good perfume, but also obscure knowledge. And in clear demonstration of this last, the list of posts on the right-hand side of the blog includes, and this is to take just one from each of the first few letters of the alphabet, Anzac Biscuits, Beck's, Cambric, Davis Gelatine, New Zealand Proprietary Limited, O'Donnell, F-Troop, Golden Syrup, Her Royal Highness the Princess Mother of Thailand, and under the letter I, inexplicability of actually choosing to be a gastroenterologist. Angus Trumble demonstrates in his writings and in his person that, to use the famous words of Robert Louis Stevenson, the world is so full of a number of things, I'm sure we should all be as happy as kings. Please make him welcome.
Thank you very much.
I alluded to your Melbourne roots, and I wonder, as we begin, whether you could start with extrapolating a little and tell us something of the clan Trumble and its history.
Well, certainly. My father's family came from Ireland in 1840. And from Scotland a little later. My mother's family also came from Scotland, both sides, at around the same time, and became pioneers in East Gippsland. In fact, drove cattle for the first time over the Dividing Range into Gippsland, which was not yet settled. So when I was growing up, I felt tremendously at home, not just in Melbourne, but in the summers growing up in East Gippsland on the lakes and within easy reach of the place which my mother's ancestor settled.
Angus Macmillan's Caledonia Australis.
Sadly, yes. He was certainly involved with the darker side of the opening up of Gippsland as well during the 1840s. Which is something that actually we found out a little bit more about after we recovered some family papers. But yeah, it's a beautiful part of the country and one to which I feel a very strong magnetism.
And the city, how long did it take to migrate to the Urbs?
Well, our Trumble ancestor, as you mentioned, was superintendent of the Kew Lunatic Asylum, which is comforting because at least he was in charge of it and not in it. And of his enormous family, 3 sons played cricket very ably. 2 played Test cricket for Australia. Our great-grandfather J.W. Trumble and his much younger brother Hugh Trumble, whose youngest son has only just died. So there's a very extraordinary generational slope that exists with this enormous number of cousins. But yes, cricket was in a way a heritage that was pressed upon me with absolutely zero effect in early childhood. Nevertheless, the beauty of moving to the United States of America is that a little knowledge goes a very long way, and I've been able to reinvent myself as a sort of cricket aficionado. Because anything I know about cricket is more than anyone else in the United States knows.
So you can use the word googly and they're
yes,
all
and
frightfully impressed.
Think I'm in possession of arcane knowledge.
The family history sees you growing up in Melbourne, and I'm going to ask the inevitable question, which I know that you will loathe. No, I won't. I won't ask the question about the first works of art that determined you on the path to being a curator. But I know that your first degree was jointly history and fine arts.
That's correct. Yes.
When did you lean one way more than the other, or have you not?
I think I haven't, actually, to be perfectly honest. It's a very, very good question. I've been interested in art all my life. My parents both made art. My father was a very talented creator. He was a solicitor, but and as such, I suppose he was perfectly positioned to execute these rather acerbic and extremely funny cartoons of legal identities in Melbourne. And in fact, at one stage, he was so surprised to discover one of his watercolours for sale in a gallery in Collins Street that he bought it. But equally, my mother was in adolescence and young adulthood followed the habit of so many young women at that time, and did watercolours, of which we have a number. So art was always part of the family environment. At school, where I was not a happy teenager, I found making art was a great refuge. And at the end of school, I applied to go to art school. And I took my folio of post-brutalist neo-Dada junk to be vetted by the Victoria College of the Arts. The dean of which at that time was an artist called John Walker, whom may be known to some people here. He has since relocated to Massachusetts. 30 years later, cut to the Yale Centre for British Art last summer, where we put on an exhibition in which John's work was exhibited, and I was able to remind him that he had in fact refused to allow me to enter the VCA.
Whereas you had allowed him to enter your institution.
I had invited him to come to New Haven. So, but I think that his decision was exactly the right one. I was hopeless and would have been, I think, a very unhappy artist.
Well, I think as a curator, or if you have curatorial instincts, that you pick up very, very early. The idea that there's an enormous amount of fabulous art out there, and you'll never be that good. And as soon as you start practicing in a museum, you realise that there's an awful lot of art out there that's absolutely dreadful, and you don't want to add to the quantum of the world's appalling art. So yes, you're better off sort of just wrangling it.
Yes. So if that insight, and I think I know exactly what you're talking about. If that insight contributed to my decision to become an art museum curator, I'm very thankful. But it didn't happen straight away, and in fact I made a pretty good attempt to become a historian first. And in a way, the work that I do outside office hours has a lot of the historical as opposed to the art historical in it.
Well, it's that line from the poet Archibald MacLeish, for history is a twisted root and art its small translucent fruit.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a line which follows. It says, and never the other way round. Art follows history. Currently, speaking of history and large world, you are in the big world in the United States of America. What's it like over there at the moment? How does it feel?
It's amazing. I've been here back for a week, and what is astonishing to me has been astonishing every day. I've just come back from Perth, where I spent the weekend at the Writers' Festival there. I'm completely astonished by the scale and intensity of the wealth and prosperity that is here. I'm seeing none of the really the calamity that has happened and is still going on in the United States. In New England, we are now seeing, in the midst of the severest winter in living memory, people living in tent communities in Hertford, in Bridgeport, in Trumble, in Waterbury, in New London, in New Britain, and that is a pattern that is extending right across the country.
And something like 1 in 4 mortgage holders.
That's right. One in four mortgage holders in the United States owes more than the value of their house at this date. The pattern of repossessions and of foreclosures, which was halted for a time because of irregularities in the processing of these by the banks. The same banks, incidentally, that were largely responsible for bringing down the system in the first place, they were halted because of irregularities. They have now been recommenced, and so people are now being still cast out of their houses. The official rate of unemployment is approximately 10%, but in the United States, you fall off the radar screen as soon as you finish your unemployment benefit, which for approximately, depending on where you are and what your benefits provide you with, between 6 and 9 months. So after that time, you simply become a non-person. There has been, as far as I can tell in Australia, just simply not even a ripple effect of this, thanks to the fact that, you shovel something off the topsoil of Western Australia, put it in a ship and send it to China.
Daily.
And that is, and the contrast is stark. I work for a very prosperous university. Our budgets were cut by 35% the first year, an additional 40% on top of that the next year. They've stayed flat since then. We had 600 jobs were removed from an administrative staff of 6,000, 10%. It's been felt everywhere. And so that's the extraordinary thing of coming back is this, every second car is a late model Mercedes-Benz. There's cranes everywhere. Melbourne, it's been 17 years since I lived in Melbourne, but the skyline is now, has spikes and towers in places where I remember it being flat and empty. New roads whole new sectors of the inner city. Extraordinary.
Wurundjeri Way, have you managed that one yet?
No, I haven't. I don't think I'll go. I'm too frightened.
Very scary. Everything post-Jeff is a little bit scary for me.
But it's an astonishing contrast, And
that recession, and it's probably very trivial of me, but it affects the cultural industries, it affects the museum industries, because unlike here, where we have the British tradition of state support, the American museum sector is very much dependent on private philanthropy, and the endowments have been savaged to the point where some institutions can't stay open.
Yes. Although I will say, and I'm immensely grateful, Yale's endowment, although it has declined in 2008 by approximately 35%, from 22.7 billion to approximately 16 billion. How do we manage? You're absolutely right that it's small liberal arts colleges scattered all across the country, which can ill afford to lose anything, that have in some cases lost their entire endowment because of the decision, inexplicable decision of the trustees to give the entire endowment into the hands of Bernie Madoff. In the case of one small college in Wisconsin, or to the Royal Bank of Canada, or the Icelandic outfits, and so on. I mean, and doing so with the support, really, and encouragement of the ratings agencies, who were giving AAA ratings to all of these con artists.
And not a single court case, not a single conviction, and not a single jail sentence.
They are coming. They are coming. But what is remarkable is that the banks are not yet in any way recalibrated in terms of their regulation, and the prospect of achieving that legislation in this Congress is very low, because the President is really focused on moving beyond this, and really dealing with the next great, series of crises, which will be about resources, energy, oil. At this point,
which is not going to be coming from North Africa anymore.
No.
But we're not here to talk politics.
Entertaining though that might be.
Utterly baffling, as it often is. In spite of all that, you love America. You have recently acquired the status of a permanent resident.
Yes.
And a house, not a tent.
Yes. No, America has been wonderful to me. I first went in 1988. I've been back regularly. I was at university there. I did my graduate study at the Institute of Fine Arts, as you mentioned earlier, in New York. Those 2 years in New York were wonderful, because if you're interested in art and in art history and in museums, it's difficult to think of an area of the globe where in the space of, 14 miles by 2, you find a greater concentration of art institutions, of non-art institution art venues, and a flow of art objects relating to every branch of world art all the time. So that was brilliant. I mean, I spent that whole time looking at objects and learning.
So that's actually heaven for you, because you
heaven.
I won't say undisciplined, but you have a prodigal range of curatorial and historical interests.
Yes, David.
Well, I think my researchers have dug this up. There are the San Bernardino panel paintings in Perugia.
Yes.
A lovely group of 8 things painted in 1473 that... Do we know who they were by?
Yes.
Who decided? You decided?
Well, no. A consensus has emerged.
That's comforting.
Yes. This was a monument that was built and on which I worked when I spent a year in Italy in 1986-87, it was built to commemorate the translation of the relics of St. Bernardino of Siena, the great. He was a great crank and a great politician, although a mendicant friar in the 15th century. He had a tremendous impact on central Italian politics. And so the existence of oratories and monuments connected with Bernardino in a network across the centre of the peninsula is a very interesting phenomenon. But this monument was different from the rest because basically most of the images associated with this particular Franciscan saint were to do with exorcisms up to a certain point, and beyond his death they were all about miracles of healing. And so that was the subject of my extremely recherché dissertation. And in a way I'm pleased I moved on from that, because there was nothing more I could do without really...
Also, you could actually have some fun in the Renaissance and not spend your whole time on account books.
That's
which
correct,
tends to
yes.
Be
that's right. The only way you can really peg out territory in Renaissance studies these days is by conquering the archives and in a degree of granularity and focus and obsessive depth.
Or being a conservator.
Or being a conservator, that's right, a paintings conservator. Actually, one of the great differences between state art galleries in Australia and museums in America consistently is that in America it is impossible to work in an art museum as a curator and not deal daily with a paintings conservator. I know it's different in Melbourne. I should apologise to the National Gallery of Victoria if they're represented here. But in most of the other state art galleries, what's happened is that the conservation services of the various cultural agencies have been removed from individual institutions and pooled in a separate institution that bills to the various clients, which is a disincentive to work very closely with conservators wherever you are.
And the kind of corporatism which is the enemy of culture.
That's right, yes. But I'm very glad to say that my closest colleague, the colleague that I deal almost all the time with, is Mark Aronson, our very, very brilliant paintings conservator.
All right, so you can do early or Sienese Renaissance almost, and then you can also do what I think is probably a favourite period, which is the Victorians, and specifically Gilbert Scott, whose wonderful Christchurch Cathedral is now lying a shattered ruin. But your attention was on a monument here in Melbourne.
Yes, I was
here in Melbourne.
I became very interested in Gilbert Scott because he designed the tomb of Sir Charles Hotham in the Melbourne General Cemetery, which unfortunately, during the time in which I had a sort of a voodoo effect, because the moment I started looking into this monument, it was found to contain a crack that ran right up the shaft of the central column of this very impressive tomb monument, and it was dismantled and put in storage at of all places, Springvale, inside a disused crematorium. So that's that. But I did do a lot of work on Gilbert Scott's designs.
Is there an explanatory panel on the site of where it formerly stood, or
I don't think so.
A video screen?
I don't think so. I did make inquiries a few years ago, hoping that in fact there might be enough interest to have it restored. The problem with tombs and with graves of any kind is that they are technically the property of the descendants, and in this case, this was in fact the fact that it was the present Lord Hotham's property, and so he's not interested. But I had hoped that this might lead to an effort to restore it. But so far, it hasn't happened. But you're absolutely right. The disaster in Christchurch has caused, I mean, it would be terrible under any circumstances, but a particularly painful aspect is that Christchurch Cathedral in Christchurch is probably, you could argue, Gilbert Scott's greatest monument, because most of the work that Scott did in the mid-19th century was improvements to existing Gothic cathedrals, and unfortunately
there was always St Pancras.
And of course his great London commission of St Pancras Chambers. That's right, in Edgware Road, but. Yeah, in terms of his ecclesiastical commissions, the Christchurch Cathedral is one of his great works, and it's a terrible tragedy that it is essentially destroyed. I mean, I imagine they'll rebuild it. It should be rebuilt, but it's
on the same site or somewhere else. We don't know.
Well, it's an immense problem.
And at the same time, you continue to keep au fait with the latest currents in contemporary art. I noticed that your most recent exhibition is the Lurie collection, which is all YBAs and second-generation YBAs, and it's cutting edge.
Well, hardly cutting edge, but it was a great opportunity in America, and especially in New England. The great joy of working in an art museum is the immense amount of support that comes really in the form of cold calls. And in fact, 2 years ago, Sam Lurie rang up a collector of contemporary and modern British paintings, and started talking to us about giving his collection to Yale, 85 pictures, so we said yes please, and we organised an exhibition. I won't say that the fact that Sam is a very gritty personal injury attorney swayed us in any way, but I will say that Sam and his wife have been just terrific partners and model partners in terms of the generosity with which they undertook the project and allowed us to make of it something that would suit the centre and also suit the building. The building in which our museum is housed was designed actually lately in relatively recently, opened in 1977, designed by Louis Kahn. It was in fact Kahn's
first commission, wasn't it?
It was his last commission.
Last commission.
The first commission, which is on the other side of Chapel Street, was the extension, the 1949 extension to the Yale University Art Gallery, a much older, much larger and much poorer sister institution across the street.
Which has the world's only surviving Roman shield, I understand.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, there would be, I have no doubt. It's now slightly diminished because every single object removed from Machu Picchu exactly 100 years ago by Hiram Bingham III has now been repatriated to Peru under an agreement with the Republic. But that, I think, is a good thing.
And what does Yale get in exchange from Peru?
Off the hook.
Coca leaf?
Off the hook.
Well, that's all. Actually, I must apologise because that's all made you sound like a totally and utterly respectable curator, and it ignores the more exciting parts of your intellectual domain. And why don't we jump straight into it? Tell us about the Pre-Raphaelites and their obsession with wombats.
Well, this is a very important issue. I came across an old article some years ago which drew attention to a group of early drawings by D.G. Rossetti and Ned Burne-Jones of wombats, and it was suggested that this interest had occurred to these young friends when they were at Oxford together, and specifically engaged upon the frescoes that were to decorate the vault of the Oxford Union. And my curiosity was extreme, because I was astonished. I knew a little bit about kangaroos in late 18th century and early 19th century Britain because of the famous picture by George Stubbs, which awaits acquisition by one of our state or national art institutions. It is still in the clear. I mean, it's not yet in captivity. It should be the subject.
And the matching dingo too.
And the matching dingo, which isn't as good. Isn't as good, but the kangaroo is out there, and I knew something of the interest and the imminence of the kangaroo in the English countryside, even when being hunted. But I had no idea that wombats were even on the radar screen of the early Victorians, and so I looked into it, and sure enough there was a fascinating 20-year period in which the Pre-Raphaelite brethren were not just interested but approached a state of mania and obsession with wombats. I mean, they would arrange to meet at the wombats' lair in the Regent's Park Zoo. They would compose verses and exchange letters about the wombats in the acclimatisation societies in Paris and London. Christina Rossetti was writing poems, one entitled O Womibatto, which is really terrible. But it struck me as an extraordinary phenomenon and worth investigating. I think I've reached the conclusion that I think Christina Rossetti was in fact responsible for this, and started the whole ball rolling with her remarkable strange poem, The Goblin Market, for which Gabriel supplied the frontispiece, a drawing for which is in the Beinecke Red Book and Manuscript Library at Yale.
With a wombat. With a wombat.
So this, I think, will put that subject to bed for me. I think that will be the last bit of investigation that I do with it.
But there are always new subjects. There are always invitations. And I know that your first book, On the Smile, originally came as a result of an invitation to address the 14th convocation of the Royal Australian College of Dental Surgeons in Adelaide in 1998, and in fact it didn't have the punchy title. It was originally Changing Concepts of Decorum and Allure in the Representation of Teeth in Art.
Yes. Well, yes, you can see that I've been trained very well by my agent. But actually it occurs to me, David, the very first time we met was in Hobart over a weekend in which I was finishing that paper between events, and I think it was a show that was opening at your place, the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and I want to say it was maybe... It wasn't Glover, it was long before Glover, at 98, 97, 98? What would have been? Anyway, it's just come back to me that was in fact the occasion when I actually finished it, which was that weekend. That article ended up as an off-print on the desk of my wonderful agent, Mary Canane, who's been very helpful to me ever since, and it ultimately ended up turning into a book. But in the meantime, the dentists, and my talk for the dentists was very warmly received. So much so that they lobbed me on to the orthopaedic surgeons and asked me to give a talk, a similar kind of entertainment, to leaven their conference on sports hand injuries. And so I asked them if it would be okay if I gave a talk about pointing gesture. And they said yes, and I did, and it was similarly warmly received, and that ultimately turned into the finger, a handbook. So the two, for a time, ran in parallel.
Well, the interesting thing I think about the two books is that there was that great rash of popular non-fiction that followed on the success of Longitude, and there were books about salt and ice and all sorts of singular subjects. But it seems to me in both those cases, the smile and the finger, that you're not actually dealing with a singular subject. You're dealing with a topic that enables you to graze widely in the fields of history.
Stray down byways. Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And in a way, the other interesting thing that happened developing the finger was I taught a course for our Yale in London program 4 summers ago, and it was my great good fortune that the other professor who was teaching at that time was Keith Wrightson, who is a great historian of early modern England, but also a pioneer in the academic pursuit of microhistory. And in a way, it was ironic that I should have spent the summer with Keith talking about microhistory, because in a way what I've produced is the opposite. It's sort of totally macrohistory writ large. I mean, there's nothing micro about either of these topics. I mean, they look at very, very large subjects, deliberately so, and it tend to eschew
chapters of extremely intense focus. For example,
thinking of the Filbert Nail.
I am going to bring up the Filbert Nail now. For those of you who are unaware, I think I'm probably just going to have to leave it to the world authority on the Filbert Nail. Could you tell us what the hell is a Filbert Nail?
Well, you have to. It's important to realise that the only reason I was able to craft this topic really was due to the awesome nature now of online keyword searchable vast resources in terms of Victorian and late Georgian periodicals and printed books. And as I was doing a bit of scanning, trying to find information and really information about what the Regency and the early Victorians found beautiful in fingernails, I noticed very, very quickly that the word Filbert Nail became a constant. I ran into this the whole time.
And a filbert is a hazelnut.
A filbert is a hazelnut. And so I'm thinking, well, why is something round, hard, ridged and dark brown being associated with, in effect, the canon of beauty as it applies to fingernails? And this became, in a way, the question, which, to my astonishment, I was able to find the answer to, because I eventually came across an article in a Scottish medical journal that made it clear that a filbert nail is a nail whose bed is exactly semicircular and at around the scale of a small filbert. And that's the answer. But it's this.
And does the lunette
the light-coloured half-moon shape at the root of the nail is correspondingly round in the other direction. It sounds very unusual.
And where a filbert is pale, where it sits within its.
Yes, presumably. Now. It's a small matter, but what is so interesting is that in the fiction, for example, of Trollope, you have constant references to characters whose sterling character is reflected in the appearance of down to, not just of his teeth, which was the irony, because I dealt with Trollope and teeth in the first book. But equally often, reference is made to the exquisite Filbert nails that they wore, and were obviously reflected.
So it always comes back to Trollope, doesn't it?
Trollope, yes.
I mean, you really are a Victorian clergyman at heart.
Well, yes. I think probably I'm an Australian expatriate trapped, or in fact a Victorian clergyman trapped in the body of an Australian expat.
And presumably this would be a Victorian clergyman of not unsubstantial means, able to delegate most things to his rector.
Celebrate the Lord's Supper every 3 years, preach perhaps every 6 months, and get on with
and write learned
antiquarian matters. Yeah.
There's a lot more to hand, as it were. There's a great sort of medical introduction early on in the book where you talk about Hox genes. I think that's a lovely phrase. And about the movement of the hands. There's also this... you love the words, don't you? Whether it's Filbert or flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, that's what you do with your hand. And then you've got pronation and supination in your arm.
Yes. Well, I think we all know someone who's particularly supine, and of course,
anybody pronate,
and you just simply project that onto, and it immediately brings into focus what you can do with your wrist. But you mentioned the Hox genes. This was a section of the book I wrote because I felt it was necessary to give an account to. As much to make it clear in my own mind as to how the damn thing works. And the thing that I found most amazing is a recent discovery or insight, which is that portion of the of DNA that governs morphogenesis in not just in humans but in all most species, is known as the homeobox, and that portion of it that governs the disposition of the digits and the extremities are called the Hox genes. And there is an immutable rule of 5 that seems to apply that ensures that when we spring from the womb, we do so with 5 digits on each hand and 5 digits on each foot. But that this is common also to creatures as various as starfish, sponges, pandas, chickens, and fish. So, because the fins develop in an almost identical way.
Not a Mickey Mouse.
Not a Mickey Mouse, or the Simpsons, who only have 4. And this is surprising because, according to classical developmental biology, evolutionary biology, the principles of natural selection ought to mean that if you are, if you are born with an extra digit either on each hand or one, that you gain advantage from the flexibility and of having more than 5. If only for the benefit of harpists, typists, and erotomaniacs, really.
But presumably the poor little babies were exposed to the elements. But what
has happened is that, and polydactyly, which is the phenomenon of being born with an extra, is a common phenomenon, 1 in 1,000 births. It's now dealt with immediately by surgery, but it's now known that if you are born with an extra, it is not a freewheeling 6th digit, as it were, but a clone of one of the existing 5. So even in the mutation of polydactyly, you're not actually dealing with 6 digits, you're dealing with 5 plus 1 copy. Yeah. So that this rule of 5, and incidentally the ancient English word finger, it has something to do, we think, in its primitive pre-Teutonic origins with the concept of 5. The rule of 5 is absolutely rock solid and seems to be immutable And the reason, the speculation for that is that if something as fundamental as this rule of 5 were to be sliding around and changing, then there's nothing but chaos down the developmental path. But that's just a hypothesis. I mean, no one really understands quite why this is so. But the general concept of single bone, 2 bones, bunch of blob-like bones, and 5 digits or 5 extremities is something that is common to many species and goes way beyond even hominid life.
See, he's not just a curator, is he?
But isn't that amazing?
Nor even extraordinary. Nor even an historian.
Our fish cousins. It was thought at one point that pandas alone were special because they had 6 digits, but.
That's the migratory sigmoid.
Yes, it's this sort of ankle bone that's got, that's taken a detour and has developed mobility and the capacity to sort of pin shoots for ease of nibbling, but it's not strictly speaking a digit. So they've got 5 after all, and just a special ankle.